This bear cub massaged a sick golden retriever, then healed him with her paws. The morning air bit with a familiar October chill as Sarah Mason pulled her worn flannel jacket tighter around her shoulders. At 43, she'd spent nearly half her life at Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary, nestled in a remote corner of Montana where the mountains seemed to cradle the sky. She stood on the weathered porch of the main cabin, steam rising from her coffee mug, watching the sun's first light filter through the pines. These quiet moments before the sanctuary stirred to life were sacred to her, a brief interlude of peace before the day's inevitable chaos. The shrill ring of the emergency line shattered the stillness. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the radio clipped to her belt as she hurried inside, her boots leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. The voice on the other end belonged to a trucker who'd spotted something concerning along Highway 93, an injured black bear cub, barely moving, huddled against the guardrail. "How long ago did you see it?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her keys. "Not 5 minutes back." Poor thing looked half dead. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months old. Sarah thanked him and immediately dialed Dr. Mark Olson, the sanctuary's veterinarian. Mark had been with Whispering Pines almost as long as she had, arriving fresh out of veterinary school with idealistic notions about wildlife conservation that, unlike many, had never dimmed with time. "I'll meet you at the north gate in 10, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Bringing the Trank kid in the travel crate. As she headed for the door, Sarah paused by Bailey's bed in the corner of the main cabin. The elderly golden retriever barely lifted his head at her approach, a stark contrast to the dog who once bounded alongside her on every rescue mission. His muzzle had gone completely white, and his once bright eyes were clouded with cataracts. At 15, Bailey was living on borrowed time, and they both knew it. "I'll be back soon, old friend," she whispered, gently stroking his head. Bailey sighed deeply, then lowered his head back to his paws, conserving what little energy he had left. Sarah met Mark at the gate, his battered pickup already loaded with equipment. They drove in silence for the first few miles, both mentally preparing for what they might find. Wildlife rescue was unpredictable work, sometimes heartbreaking, occasionally miraculous, but never easy. "Think it's from the Blackwater Ridge area?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Fish and Wildlife reported a female with 2 cubs there last spring. "Could be," Sarah replied, eyes scanning the roadside. "If it is, we need to figure out what happened to the mother and the other cub." They found the bear cub exactly where the trucker had described, a small black heap against the metal guardrail. As they approached slowly, Sarah could see it was breathing but barely moving, a female cub, severely underweight and trembling violently. What caught Sarah's attention immediately, however, was a strange marking on the cub's right shoulder, a swirling, spiral-shaped scar that looked almost like a brand. "What do you make of that?" she asked Mark, who was already preparing a sedative. He leaned closer, careful not to startle the cub. "Burns," he said grimly. "That's from a fire, and not too long ago. Looks like it healed without infection, which is a miracle in itself." The cub made no attempt to flee as they approached, a worrying sign that spoke volumes about her condition. Her eyes, though, remained alert, watching their every move with a weary intelligence that pierced Sarah's heart. There was something in that gaze, not just fear or pain, but a strange knowing quality that Sarah had rarely seen in wildlife so young. "She's a fighter," Sarah murmured as Mark administered the sedative. "Look at her, still watching us, still planning her next move even when she can barely stand." As the cub's eyes finally fluttered closed, Sarah carefully wrapped her in a thermal blanket. Ember, she said suddenly. That's what we'll call her, like an ember that survived the fire. Mark nodded, understanding the symbolism. In their line of work, names mattered. They were acknowledgments of individual stories of survival against the odds. And this little bear, with her mysterious burn scar spiraling like a forgotten constellation across her shoulder, had clearly survived something devastating. The ride back to Whispering Pines was tense, with Mark monitoring Ember's vitals while Sarah drove. By the time they arrived, Jed Thompson, the sanctuary's longest-serving volunteer, had prepared the medical cabin and alerted the staff. Jed, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s with hands as gnarled as tree roots, had been with Whispering Pines since its inception. His weathered face creased with concern as they carried Ember inside. "Poor little thing," he murmured, helping them transfer the cub to the examination table. "Reminds me of that wolf pup we got last winter. All skin and bones but still had fight in her eyes." Mark's examination confirmed their initial assessment: severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the curious burn that had scarred but not disabled her. "She's maybe 8 months old," he said, measuring her length. "Should weigh twice this. Mother's been gone a while, I'd guess." "Forest fire?" Sarah asked, thinking of the burn mark. "Possibly," Mark said, "but there was that controlled burn that got out of hand near Blackwater Ridge back in August. Could have separated her from her mother." Then, as Mark worked, Sarah found herself drawn to Ember's unusual scar. Unlike typical burn patterns, this one formed an almost perfect spiral, as though some cosmic finger had traced a whirlpool onto the cub's shoulder. She'd seen countless injuries in her years at the sanctuary, but something about this mark seemed deliberate, almost significant. "We'll start her on fluids in a specialized formula," Mark said, interrupting her thoughts. "If she makes it through the night, we'll have a better sense of her chances." Sarah nodded, already preparing the small isolation enclosure where Ember would spend her first days at the sanctuary. It was protocol for new arrivals, a quiet space away from the other animals where they could be closely monitored. This particular enclosure happened to be adjacent to the main cabin, where Bailey spent most of his days now, too weak to join the daily routines of the sanctuary. That first night was critical. Sarah slept on a cot beside Ember's enclosure, waking every 2 hours to check on the cub and administer fluids. By dawn, Ember's breathing had stabilized, and she had even accepted a small amount of formula from the feeding syringe. Tiny victories that Sarah had learned to celebrate in her years of rehabilitation work. As the sun rose, Sarah stepped outside to stretch her cramped muscles. Through the window of the main cabin, she could see Bailey in his bed, barely visible beneath his blanket. The old dog hadn't eaten properly in days, and Dr. Mark had gently suggested that it might be time to consider euthanasia if his condition didn't improve. The thought sent a sharp pain through Sarah's chest. Bailey had been more than just the sanctuary's resident dog. He had been her constant companion through divorce, through her father's death, through the lean years when the sanctuary nearly closed for lack of funding. Over the next few days, Ember's physical condition improved steadily. Her eyes grew brighter, her movements more coordinated, but she displayed an unusual behavior that puzzled the staff: an intense, almost pathological fear of fire. When Jed lit the wood stove in the main cabin, Ember retreated to the farthest corner of her enclosure, trembling violently. Even the striking of a match would send her into a panic. Not surprising, given that scar, Mark observed. Trauma like that leaves more than physical marks. Yet despite this fear, Sarah noticed something curious. while Ember avoided the area of her enclosure closest to the wood stove. She seemed inexplicably drawn to the corner nearest Bailey's bed. Several times Sarah found the cub pressed against the mesh, as close as she could get to the old dog, who remained largely oblivious to her presence. "It's like she senses something in him," Jed remarked one evening as they watched Ember stretching toward Bailey's bed, "something familiar." Maybe Sarah had seen enough unusual animal behaviors over the years to know that sometimes instinct operated on levels humans couldn't fully comprehend. But there was something particularly striking about the young bear's fixation on the dying dog, as if she recognized in Bailey a kindred spirit, another being hovering in that liminal space between life and death. October gave way to November, bringing the first heavy snows and temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. The sanctuary grew quieter as many of the rehabilitated animals had been released before winter set in, and those remaining required less intensive care. Bailey's condition continued to deteriorate. He now rarely lifted his head when Sarah entered the room, and his once robust body had wasted to a shadow of its former self. It was on one particularly cold night, with the wind howling through the pines and the temperature plummeting to negative digits, that something extraordinary happened. Sarah had been working late updating the sanctuary's records when she heard a strange sound from the main cabin. She found Ember's enclosure door ajar. The latch had come loose, a rare oversight in their careful protocols. But what froze Sarah in her tracks was the sight that greeted her. Ember, who normally cowered in fear from the fireplace, had made her way to Bailey's bed and was curled against the old dog's side. Bailey's eyes were open, watching the bear cub with what Sarah could only describe as serenity. Neither animal seemed distressed by this unprecedented proximity. Rather, they appeared to be taking comfort in each other's presence. Sarah stood motionless, afraid that any movement might disrupt this fragile tableau. She watched as Ember shifted slightly, pressing her small body more firmly against Bailey's side, her head coming to rest against his chest. The old dog sighed deeply, his breath ruffling the cub's fur, but made no move to distance himself from this unusual bedmate. Eventually, Sarah retreated without disturbing them, her mind racing with questions. By morning, she expected to find Ember back in her enclosure, the night's strange communion perhaps nothing more than a dream born of exhaustion. Instead, she discovered both animals still together, Bailey's tail giving a feeble thump against his bed, the first voluntary movement she'd seen from him in weeks. "You're not going to believe this," she told Mark when he arrived for his weekly checkup of the sanctuary's residents. She led him to the window where they could observe the unlikely pair without disturbing them. Mark watched in silence for several minutes, his scientific mind visibly working to process what he was seeing. "I've never," he began, then shook his head. "In 20 years of veterinary practice, I've never seen anything like this." "Well, should we separate them?" Sarah asked, though she already knew her preference. Mark considered this. "Bailey's not distressed. Quite the opposite. He seems more alert than he has in months. And Ember's vital signs were stronger at yesterday's check than they've been since she arrived." He shrugged. "Sometimes the best medicine isn't medicine at all." From that day forward, a new routine established itself at Whispering Pines. Each morning, Ember would return to her enclosure for feeding and examination. But as the day progressed, she would grow increasingly restless until Sarah or one of the staff would open the small door they'd installed between her space and Bailey's. The cub would immediately make her way to the old dog's side, often carrying a small stick or piece of bark that she would carefully place beside him before settling down. This ritual fascinated everyone at the sanctuary. Agnes Whitaker, a retired nurse who volunteered 3 days a week, was particularly moved by it. "It's like she's bringing him offerings," Agnes observed one afternoon as Ember placed a particularly straight pine twig alongside Bailey's blanket. "My grandmother would have called it medicine, not the kind doctors give, but the old kind, the healing energy that passes between living things." Agnes had been suffering from insomnia since her husband's death 2 years earlier, often arriving at the sanctuary with shadows beneath her eyes and a thermos of coffee clutched in her trembling hands. But after a few weeks of tending to Ember and witnessing the bear's strange communion with Bailey, the staff noticed a change in her as well. She seemed more rested, her movements more fluid, her smile quicker to appear. "I'm sleeping through the night now," she confided to Sarah one morning. "First time since Harold passed. Started right after I began cleaning Ember's enclosure." She laughed self-consciously. "Sounds silly, doesn't it? But I swear that little bear has some kind of gift." It wasn't just Agnes who seemed affected by Ember's presence. A young deer named Willow, who had been brought to the sanctuary after being struck by a car, had shown signs of trauma since her arrival: flattened ears, excessive vigilance, refusal to approach humans. Yet staff began noticing that when Ember was taken outside for supervised exploration, Willow would approach the fence of her enclosure, ears gradually lifting from their flattened position. Perhaps most remarkably, a red-tailed hawk that had been refusing food since its rescue began perching alertly on its post after Ember's outdoor enclosure was relocated nearby. Within days, the hawk was eating normally again, its recovery accelerating beyond all expectations. Mark attempted to explain these phenomena scientifically. "There could be something in her scent or behavior that affects the nervous systems of other animals," he suggested during one of their weekly staff meetings. "Perhaps she's releasing pheromones that have a calming effect, or her movements trigger some kind of biophilic response." But Sarah, who had witnessed the inexplicable many times in her years working with wildlife, was less concerned with the mechanism than the result. Whatever Ember was doing, consciously or unconsciously, it was having a profound effect on the sanctuary's residents, human and animal alike. Most significant was Bailey's transformation. The change was gradual but unmistakable. First the tail wagging, then improved appetite, then astonishingly, attempts to stand. By Christmas, the old dog who had been at death's door in October was able to walk short distances, his gait unsteady but purposeful, always with Ember padding quietly beside him. "It's not a full recovery," Mark cautioned after examining Bailey one snowy afternoon in January. "His organs are still failing. His arthritis is severe, and those tumors aren't going away, but his quality of life has improved dramatically. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah knew he was right to temper their expectations. Bailey was still an elderly dog with multiple health issues. But watching him now, alert, engaged, even playful at times, she couldn't help but feel they were witnessing something miraculous. It was around this time that Jed shared a story he'd never told before. The three of them, Sarah, Mark, and Jed, were sitting around the wood stove one evening, watching Ember and Bailey dozing side by side on the dog's bed. "There's something about that bear that's been nagging at me," Jed said, his voice low and contemplative. "Something I saw years back when Bailey was in his prime." He described an incident from nearly a decade earlier, a forest fire that had broken out unexpectedly near the sanctuary. Sarah remembered it well. They'd been forced to evacuate several animals and had nearly lost the east cabin to the flames. Bailey got loose during the evacuation. Jed continued. He took off into the woods like he was on a mission. I followed him, couldn't let him run into that fire. He led me straight to a clearing where a female black bear was trapped, her paw caught under a fallen tree that was starting to burn. Sarah and Mark exchanged glances. This was the first they had heard of this story. Bailey stood there barking until I caught up. Then just waited while I freed that bear. Never seen anything like it, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Jed's weathered face creased in a smile. Never told anyone about it. Who'd believe an old man's tale about a bush rescuing a bear? Why are you telling us now? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Jed nodded toward Ember, sleeping peacefully with her head resting on Bailey's flank. That spiral mark on her shoulder, it's identical to a birthmark the mother bear had on her chest. Same exact pattern. Noticed it right away but thought I must be imagining things. The implications hung in the air between them. Could Ember possibly be the offspring of the bear Bailey had helped rescue years ago? The time frame made it plausible. Black bears lived 20 to 30 years in the wild, and they remembered territories and food sources across generations. You think she came back? Mark asked, his scientific skepticism evident in his tone. That she somehow knew Bailey needed help the way he once helped her mother? Jed shrugged. Nature's got more mysteries than we've got answers. All I know is I've spent 50 years watching wildlife and I've never seen coincidences like this. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Ember continued to grow stronger and wilder. She was now spending more time in the outdoor enclosure, learning to forage and developing the natural wariness of humans that would be essential for her eventual release. But each night, without fail, she would return to Bailey's side, continuing her ritual of bringing a small offering, a stick, a pine cone, a particularly smooth stone, before settling down beside him. Bailey, for his part, had stabilized in a way none of them had thought possible. He would never again be the vigorous dog who had once patrolled the sanctuary's perimeter, but he was comfortable, engaged with his surroundings, and most importantly, appeared happy. His eyes followed Sarah around the room. His tail wagged when Jed scratched behind his ears. He even attempted to play with the soft toys Agnes brought out for him, though his arthritic jaws could barely grip them. By Ember's second autumn at Whispering Pines, it was clear that she was ready to return to the wild. She had grown into a healthy young bear with all the skills she would need to survive, and crucially, she had maintained her natural fear of humans. Despite her unusual bond with Bailey, the decision to release her was both necessary and heartbreaking. Everyone at the sanctuary had grown attached to the bear with the spiral mark and the healing presence. They chose a remote area of national forest near Blackwater Ridge for the release, close to where Ember had likely been born, far from roads and human habitation. The night before, Sarah spent hours sitting beside Bailey's bed. Ember curled up against the old dog as always. I don't know if you understand what's happening, Sarah said softly to the bear, but tomorrow you go back where you belong, back to the wild. Ember's dark eyes regarded her with that same inscrutable intelligence Sarah had noticed on the day they found her. There was no way to know how much the bear comprehended, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Ember understood more than any of them realized. The release itself was simple and unceremonious, as all good wildlife releases should be. They transported Ember in a specialized crate to the selected site, opened the door, and stepped back. The young bear hesitated only briefly before lumbering into the forest, pausing once to look back at the humans who had saved her life before disappearing among the trees. The drive back to the sanctuary was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself wondering if they would ever know what became of Ember, if the bear would thrive in her natural habitat, perhaps one day having cubs of her own with the same mysterious spiral marking. Bailey seemed to sense the change immediately upon their return. He lifted his head when they entered, his rheumy eyes searching the space behind them as if expecting Ember to appear. When she didn't, he let out a soft whine, the first vocalization he'd made in months, before settling his head back on his paws with a deep sigh. "He knows," Agnes whispered, wiping away a tear. "He understands she's gone." In the weeks that followed, they all watched Bailey carefully for signs of decline, worried that without Ember's presence, he might slip back toward the precipice. But though the old dog seemed subdued, he continued to eat, to engage with his human companions, to enjoy the gentle autumn sunlight that streamed through the cabin windows. And then one morning in late November, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. In the exact spot where Ember used to lie beside Bailey's bed, a small green shoot had pushed its way up through the floorboards, an impossibility in a cabin with solid wood flooring. Yet there it was, a tiny, vibrant sapling, its leaves unfurling toward the light. "How is this even possible?" Mark asked when Sarah showed us, crouching to examine the phenomenon. "There's no soil here, no water source. It shouldn't be able to grow." Yet grow it did, defying all logical explanation. Within days, the sapling was 6 inches tall. Within weeks, it had reached toward the ceiling, necessitating a modification to the cabin roof to accommodate its upward trajectory. The species was unfamiliar to them, not quite pine, not quite aspen, with leaves that seemed to shimmer with an inner light when the sun hit them just so. "It's her final gift," Agnes declared firmly, brooking no argument. "A piece of life she left behind." Whether scientific explanation or mystical interpretation, the tree that grew beside Bailey's bed became a source of quiet wonder for everyone at Whispering Pines. Visitors to the sanctuary often commented on its unusual beauty and the peaceful feeling that seemed to emanate from its presence. Bailey lived another full year, far longer than any veterinarian would have predicted, given his condition when Ember arrived. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, beneath the spreading branches of the mysterious tree that now filled that corner of the cabin with dappled light and the subtle scent of pine and honey. They buried him beneath a stand of aspens at the edge of the sanctuary property, in a spot where the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves in patterns that reminded Sarah of Ember's spiral mark. As they stood around the grave, Sarah, Mark, Jed, Agnes, and the other staff members who had known and loved the old dog, a black bear appeared briefly at the forest's edge, watching them with solemn eyes before melting back into the shadows. No one could say with certainty that it was Ember. Black bears are common in that part of Montana, and from a distance, one looks much like another. But Sarah liked to think it was her, returning one last time to say goodbye to the one who had helped her heal, just as she had helped him. The story of Ember and Bailey spread beyond the confines of Whispering Pines. A local newspaper did a feature on the sanctuary that mentioned their unusual bond. This was picked up by regional media, then national outlets. Soon, Sarah was fielding calls from journalists and documentary filmmakers eager to tell the story of the bear cub and the elderly dog who had saved each other. She agreed to some interviews, declined others, always careful to present the story factually while acknowledging the elements that defied easy explanation. The resulting publicity brought much-needed donations to the sanctuary, allowing them to expand their facilities and help more animals in need. But perhaps more meaningful were the letters and emails that began arriving from around the country. From elderly people who had found new companions in shelter animals, from veterans struggling with PTSD who found solace in wildlife rehabilitation, from children inspired to pursue careers in conservation. "That little bear didn't just save a dog," wrote Mr. Peterson, a Vietnam veteran from Oregon. "She reminded us that even after being scorched by loss, we can move forward with gentleness." That's a lesson this old soldier needed to learn. 5 years after Ember's release, a wildlife biologist conducting research in the Blackwater Ridge area reported sighting a female black bear with 2 cubs, all 3 bearing the distinctive spiral marking on their shoulders or chests. The biologist, initially skeptical of the story he'd heard about whispering pines, included photographs in his report that left little room for doubt. Ember had not only survived but thrived, passing on both her genes and her mysterious marking to a new generation. For Sarah, this confirmation brought a sense of completion to a circle that had begun on that chilly October morning years earlier. The sanctuary continued its work, rescuing and rehabilitating countless animals, each with their own story of survival. But none quite matched the profound impact of a bear cub named Ember, who had carried within her something more powerful than science could measure, a capacity to transmit life's essential energy through nothing more complicated than presence. In the main cabin of Whispering Pines, the mysterious tree continues to grow, its roots somehow finding purchase in impossible places, its branches reaching toward the sky in defiance of conventional understanding. Beneath it, a new generation of injured animals finds rest and healing, while above, the Montana sky wheels through its seasons, summer to fall, winter to spring, an eternal cycle of death and rebirth that connects all living things in ways both visible and invisible. And somewhere in the forest surrounding Blackwater Ridge, a black bear with a spiral marking moves through the underbrush, teaching her cubs to forage and climb and survive, carrying forward a legacy of resilience and connection that transcends species, transcends understanding, and speaks to the deepest truth of what it means to be alive on this fragile, magnificent planet we all share.